Change is never easy. Whether it is moving to a new school, meeting a new group of friends, or simply trying a new recipe for dinner, change can be a scary and uncertain thing. In fact, the Japanese rulers of the early modern period were so afraid of change and foreign influence that they refused to allow foreigners to even land on the islands for nearly 250 years. Perhaps even more surprising is the enthusiasm with which Japan changed after contact with the West was resumed in the 19th century. Prior to the beginning of the Tokugawa shogunate in 1603, Japan had traded widely with China and other regional powers in East Asia. Indeed, Japan had maintained tenuous trading relations with a few European powers after the West's discovery of Japan in 1542, when a Portuguese ship bound for China was blown off course. As the Tokugawas consolidated their power over the islands, they became increasingly suspicious of foreigners, especially those Westerners who had successful trading relations with the previous regime. In the first decades of the shogunate, the Japanese rulers banned foreign trade and prohibited the spread of Christianity, and finally, in 1639, they banned foreigners from the Japanese mainland entirely, only allowing some heavily restricted trade with Chinese and Dutch merchants on outlying islands who had no record of Christian evangelization. In 1641, this strict isolationist policy was officially implemented, and Japanese subjects were barred from leaving the islands altogether. This policy remained in effect in Japan for over 2 centuries. The system was sternly enforced until the power of the shogunate waned due to financial problems arising from the decay of the Japanese feudal system. A series of famines, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions in the early 19th century caused revenues for the ruling samurai classes to fall, and they attempted to recoup these losses through increased taxation. The taxation fell upon the poorer parts of society who could least afford to pay, and popular riots swept across the islands. Additional pressure to the system was brought by those same foreign powers that had been shut out of Japan 2 centuries earlier. In the 17th century, Russia tried unsuccessfully to force Japan to open up to foreign trade, and similar expeditions were made by Western European nations in the early 18th century. It was not until the United States sent a war fleet to Japan under Commodore Matthew Perry that Japan was forced to open its ports to foreign traders. Perry's 4 ships anchored in Tokyo Bay within sight of the Japanese capital. The new steamships, billowing with smoke, amazed the Japanese, who because of their stern isolationism had yet to have contact with Western industrialization. The display was intended to be dramatic. Perry believed that only a show of force would compel the Japanese to open up to foreign trade. After giving the Japanese leaders a series of gifts, Perry left Tokyo Bay, informing the leaders he would return the following year, expecting a decision from the Japanese rulers as to whether they would begin trading with the West. The United States was interested in opening Japan to foreign trade for several reasons. With the annexation of California, the U.S. now possessed a huge swath of land on the Pacific coast, and therefore became more interested in Pacific trade. Additionally, the recent opening of China to foreign trade meant U.S. ships needed friendly ports from which to refuel on the long Pacific voyage. Japan was seen as a natural rest stop. Finally, Perry's steamships represented perhaps the U.S.'s greatest interest in the opening of Japan, the acquisition of resources. Indeed, steamships required large quantities of coal to continue running, and Japan was long thought to be rich in the resource. In the year after Perry's ominous visit, debate about how to respond raged across Japan. In the end, the Tokugawa shogunate caved to Western demands, and in 1854 signed a treaty with the United States agreeing to open up 2 ports to foreign trade. In 1858, the two countries signed an additional treaty, opening up trade in even more cities across the Japanese coast and even allowing foreigners to reside in a few select Japanese cities. The decision proved disastrous for the Tokugawa shogunate. Japan was already in economic straits before the Perry expedition, and the flood of foreign currency into the Japanese market caused a collapse. Many samurai leaders soon began calling for reform and change, and in 1867 the Tokugawa shogunate fell, replaced by the traditional Japanese emperor, though the real power in Japan was held by several of the most powerful samurai. This system evolved into something akin to the constitutional monarchies of the West. Following the institution of the Meiji Emperorship in 1867, the samurai began instituting a series of reforms to both deal with the influx of foreign trade in Japan and ready the country for its own industrialization. During the next half-century, the Japanese completed modernizing reforms with an astounding speed. Railroads and telegraphs soon connected parts of Japan, which only a few years before had been several days of travel apart. In response to foreign trade, Japan's domestic shipping industry grew exponentially. Additionally, the rulers of the Meiji period implemented a strict westernization of Japanese culture. Educational reforms were introduced and Western-style universities were founded. A centralized army replaced the semi-feudal daimyo system which had previously existed, and the existing Japanese class system was eliminated. The traditional ruling class, the samurai, was eliminated and they were stripped of their symbolic right to carry swords in public. However, not all were happy with Japanese westernization and industrialization, especially the samurai who had been stripped of their traditional rights. In response, many samurai joined the Satsuma Rebellion in 1877. The rebellion was short-lived and was annihilated by the standardized, westernized Japanese military. The rebellion is often seen as the last stand of the samurai and the last obstacle to Japan's full-fledged westernization in the second half of the 19th century. In closing, without the U.S.'s increasing interest in Pacific trade, the westernization of Japan may never have occurred. Indeed, it was Perry's show of force in 1853 which forced the Tokugawa shogunate to relent and permit foreign trade. Though it doomed the Tokugawas, the ensuing Meiji period saw Japan rapidly industrialize their economy and modernize education and communication standards, as well as westernize Japanese society. Whether this final change was a good thing for Japan remains a bone of contention among scholars, but the country's implementation of Western-style economy, business, and infrastructure made Japan a major player on the international level by the early 20th century.